A surprising turn of events, dozens of countries joining Israel in a boycott against the UN's controversial Durban summit. The conference on combating racism, ironically mired with a history of anti-Semitism. But things didn't exactly go as the boycotters expected. Durban IV, held on the 20th anniversary of the first anti-racism conference, was a fairly empty affair at the UN on Wednesday. 34 nations co-signing onto an Israeli-led boycott of the event over its repeated history of delving into openly anti-Semitic rhetoric. United States Ambassador to the UN, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, for one, saying that the United States is committed to working on the issue of racism, but will do so in a more, quote, inclusive setting, adding that Washington still holds concerns over the summit's results and faults the anti-Israel and anti-Semitic underpinnings of the Durban process. All that said, much to the surprise of many, reports show that Israel was not even mentioned at this year's event. Rather, discussions shifting as they should to racial or religious discrimination, intolerance, and xenophobia in general, and issues like COVID vaccine disparities and recognition and reparations for injustices caused by slavery in particular. Criticism of Israel, meantime, instead patiently held for the UN General Assembly, and most comments focusing on the Israel-Palestinian conflict through arguments in favor of a negotiated two-state solution. Leaders from the United States, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia among the many calling for a return to talks, but others a little bit more radical. Iranian President Raisi accusing Israel of slaughtering women and children and of being the biggest sponsor of state terrorism. And Qatar, while on the one hand urging the world not to shun the Taliban, on the other hand, similarly accusing Jerusalem of numerous alleged human rights violations, including starting the May conflict between Israel and Hamas with repeated abuses of Muslim and Christian religious sites. Such accusations, however, are often levied at Israel without merit. The war in May of last year in particular being sparked by Hamas terrorists who indiscriminately fired over 4,000 missiles towards civilian communities in Israel, starting with the Old City in Jerusalem. And this escalation itself, while typically blamed on Israeli presence at the Temple Mount, in actuality started weeks before, with the collapse of Palestinian elections and a sharp rise in attacks against Jews, later dubbed the TikTok Intifada. In other news, just 24 hours after being cut from the Democrats' spending bill, a new separate bill to provide $1 billion for Israel's Iron Dome defense system already introduced to the United States Congress, and it's set for a vote later today. Chair of the U.S. House Appropriations Committee, Connecticut Democrat Rosa DeLauro, saying that the United States' commitment to the security of our friend and ally Israel is ironclad, and replenishing interceptors used to protect Israel from attacks is our legal and moral responsibility, end quote. Again, though, if every politician felt this way, then the aid likely wouldn't have been cut in the first place. Political analysts therefore awarding the so-called squad with a symbolic victory, adding that it's time to acknowledge how the supposed progressive wing in government holds more influence than it's given credit for. Joining with more is founder and president of the Jerusalem Washington Center, Gideon Israel. Gideon, thanks so much for joining us. Now, what is your initial reaction to the cutting and then reintroducing of this $1 billion in spending?
Well, from an Israeli perspective, I think it was quite odd to see how Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, immediately called Steny Hoyer, the House Majority Leader, to find out, what's going on. It seems as if, like, the Iron Dome, it has more of a central role in Israel's defense doctrine than it should. At the end of the day, it shoots down short-range or mid-range missiles. It shouldn't be such a big deal. Obviously, we want to know what's going on. Why was it cut? Why was it taken out of the bill? But it shouldn't be such a big deal that money for the Iron Dome was cut.
So now, I want to talk a little bit about the squad, as I mentioned earlier. The more liberal elements within the Democratic Party killed the provision for Israel, for this Israel aid in the larger spending bill. So even though a new bill has already been proposed, and it's likely to pass, many are arguing that they have far more sway than they're given credit for. How do you respond?
Well, it wasn't only the squad. I think there were other progressive elements of the Democratic Party who were against it. I think one was, for example, Pramelia Jayapal from Washington State, and other members, I think, of the Progressive Caucus who were also against this. But the reality is that the Democrats have a slim majority. When you have a slim majority and everything passes on partisan lines, then if 4 or 5 or 10 votes aren't there, then the bill dies. So So it might be a symbolic victory because of the small majority that the Democrats have. But I think what happened is presents an opportunity for Israel to reassess the aid that they get from America. I mean, the aid that Israel is getting from America is in the same format as it's been for the past 35 years. A lot of things have changed in the past 35 years. Israel's economy is much stronger. In so many ways, Israel is so much stronger. And I think the current way that Israel receives aid in terms of cash coming to Israel, and even though most of it's spent back in the United States, I think it's time for Israel to reassess that aid. It should also be mentioned, I mean, we call it aid, but this is probably one of the better investments of the United States in foreign policy. We saw in Afghanistan how within a few weeks, $90 billion, which is roughly the same amount of money that Israel has received for the past 30 years, went down the drain as the Taliban got hold of all the weapons that were given to the Afghan army. So while we call it aid, it really is an investment, and it's a very good investment for America. Remember, no soldiers in Israel, less presence in the Eastern Mediterranean. So it's a very good investment for America.
All right, and very quickly, I know that the argument comes up all the time about how Israel is supposedly becoming a partisan issue, despite both Republicans and Democrats insisting that support is bipartisan. Is Israel becoming a partisan issue? Because it seems increasingly that it is.
It's not totally a partisan issue, but remember, I think in a recent Pure Gallup poll, it said around 50% of Democrats supported a strong relationship with Israel. So obviously, there's much more Republican support than there is Democratic support. Remember, in 2015, when the Prime Minister of Israel came to the Congress and said that the Iran deal is an existential issue, please vote against it, only 25 out of about 170 Democrats in the House of Representatives voted against it, and only 4 Democrats out of about 48 Democrats in the Senate voted against it. So there's obviously a lot more support from Israel on the Republican side than on the Democratic side. And in addition, we're seeing anti-Israel forces within the Democratic Party are much stronger than they were 10 years ago, not to mention 20 and 30 years ago.
Gideon Israel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
On a related note, on the surface, it may be offensive to even consider cutting any U.S. aid to Israel, especially depending on the reasons. But there are those who don't consider the aid to be aid at all. So would the loss of this cash be a blessing in disguise? Israeli activist Rudy Ruckman argues yes, and he's here now with us to explain. Rudy, why are you against this $1 billion in aid?
Well, first of all, the aid is mostly not money. It's weapons and sort of equipment given to the IDF in order for us to be dependent on the United States. I was one of the first drafts in the IDF in 2011 that started to use US-made boots rather than the Israeli company Brill that was making boots in Israel. So with time, more and more stuff created in Israel, whether it be our guns, our bullets, our bases, our uniforms, our boots, are now, instead of being made in Israel and developing the economy, helping the economy, are being made in the United States. And I don't want Israel to be dependent on the United States. So aid is great, but it's not really aid. It's really weapons being given to Israel, and Israel should not be dependent. Now, if we want to buy things from other countries, for example, America, we shouldn't invest all of our eggs into the same basket. And so the U.S. foreign aid, we have to understand exactly what it is. It's basically financing weapon companies from the United States and making us completely dependent on the United States, which is something that we should be against.
All right, well, isn't this aid in particular meant for replacing Iron Dome missiles used during the conflict with Hamas back in May? Is Israel capable of taking over the manufacturing for this job, right now?
I mean, Israel is capable of taking out Hamas in the first place, that we wouldn't need the Iron Dome to begin with. But we're not doing that because we're not focused on long-term solutions to really benefit the country on the long scale. We're really focusing on short-term strategies that benefit certain corporations and weapon companies to keep selling and providing this quote-unquote aid to Israel. Now, of course, the Democrats, those that voted against this bill, weren't doing it from a place to better the society, better the environment, better the relations. They were doing it from a place that their voters are becoming more and more anti-Israel. And so to appease that base, they wanted to show that they're divesting in a way from Israel. But regardless of where this aid is being pulled out of, I want Israel to be completely dependent on itself and to manufacture its own, from the foods, from the vegetables, to even the weapons. We should be dependent completely on ourselves and not on other countries.
So, where exactly do you draw the line? Because if Israel, for example, negotiated fewer strings attached to such cash infusions, would that be worth it to you?
Yeah, well, let's talk about those strings, because I think most people don't understand that. With the deal that we have, where we're having billions of dollars, but those billions of dollars are really in the form of weapons, then we can't sell weapons to certain countries without the authorization of the United States. We can't buy weapons from other countries without the authorization from other countries. And it's not just weapons, it's also intelligence. I don't want my country to be going into a deal where in order to get something, we have to basically sell our soul. So we have to create a deal, if we have deals, where we're not dependent only on one country, and that it doesn't come with all these ties attached to it. Now, if we are to depend, let's say, for example, planes, right? Israel could have potentially built Tel Aviv many years ago, but let's say today we do need to buy planes. I don't want to invest in only one place. I want Israel to be dependent on many different places so that if one of those places falls, it has other options. Right now, we're fully invested into the United States. What happens tomorrow if the United States becomes anti-Israel? What happens tomorrow if the United States falls? What do we do? We're not ready for that situation. And Israel, especially with our history as Am Yisrael, we should be ready for all situations and not wait for the moment for people to turn on us.
And you already see this perhaps playing out with negotiations opposite Iran?
Yeah, look, Iran is our current problem, right? It's a current problem in the region, and I don't even think Iran has a particular issue with Israel. I think their vision is to conquer the entire Middle East and eventually recreate the Persian Empire and to conquer the rest of the world. And what is the immediate country that is the strongest in the region? It's Israel. And also, what is the country that till now most of the Arab world was against, and that they could unite and bring behind their own movement? If they're against Israel, then they would be uniting all. I think that's really the interest of Iran being anti-Israel, but they're trying to get to the stage of the world in order to become, one of the countries that are the strongest in the world. So I think if we want to be dependent, if we want to create a better future for ourselves, we have to become independent. And of course, that takes time. We're a new country. We're 73 years old, and we have to make the moves in order to become completely independent and not dependent on countries, especially the United States, which we clearly see a trajectory of anti-Semitism rising, of politicians being more and more anti-Israel. Why would we be dependent on those countries? Again, I want to remind everyone, it's not about being against relations with the United States. It's not being against getting aid or help, true aid from other countries or having relations. It's about toxic relations. It's about relations that have string attached to them. That means bad for Israel and us being dependent and not being independent.
All right, Rudy Ruckman, thank you so much for your insights. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how the shift of American policy on aid to Israel will happen in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Moving on, Israel's ICUs filling up more and more, stretching resources thinner and thinner as coronavirus infections continuing to balloon. Another 6,000 infections confirmed overnight for a total of 69,000 active patients, 723 of whom are in serious condition, and the spread rate holding at about 5.6%. While the death toll rising to 7,592. Health Ministry Director General Nachman Ash then now calling to renew heavy restrictions on the public before the healthcare system can be overwhelmed.
אנחנו רוצים להתאים את ההגבלות שיש בחתונות למצבים אחרים שבהם יש התקהלויות המוניות. אנחנו מדברים על זה שבמתחם סגור לא יהיו מעל 400, במתחם פתוח לא יהיו מעל 500. אם התחלואה לא תרד, אני חושב שצריך לחזור לצעדים האלה.
Ash explaining that there's a limit to what the healthcare teams can do, and that the unvaccinated must go get inoculated as soon as possible, especially as younger Israelis without all 3 vaccinations and the unvaccinated are accounting for some 80% of COVID hospitalizations, nearly twice their relative share of the population. As for why the COVID cabinet hasn't met for 2 weeks to address these issues, however, Ash adding that the holidays likely precluded in-person meetings, but that the morbidity rate is by no means being overlooked.
אני לא חושב שהיא מתעלמת. יש הרבה צעדים שנעשים ויש הרבה חשיבה יש אבל אמירה מאוד ברורה של הממשלה שהמשק רוצים שהוא יישאר פתוח, שמערכת החינוך תהיה פתוחה, שהתלמידים ילמדו ככל שניתן בצורה פרונטלית. זה ההנחיה של הממשלה הזאת, ההחלטה שלה, ולפי זה פועלים. אבל יש הרבה צעדים של הבדיקות המהירות, של התו הירוק, אכיפה שנעשית, יש הרבה פעילות שנעשית כדי לנסות בתנאים האלה להתמודד עם התו.
Now, in COVID-related news, we return to the tarmac. Israeli airliner El Al rejecting the finance ministry's $50 million aid plan. Instead, El Al CEO Avigal Sorek demanding double as compensation for the, quote, damages caused to El Al by the state's decisions. The current recovery plan would see El Al cut its fleet by 35% to just 29 planes, as well as fire some 1,500 employees, on top of the 2,000 already laid off. Consumer behavior expert and assistant professor Vili Abraham joining me to discuss. Vili, thanks so much for being with us. Now, what do you make of El Al's counter offer?
Well, the government is offering 50 million shekels, and the owner has to infuse 43 million. So we're talking about more or less 100 million. It's short of the 150 million that the company needs. And if you read the reports published in the media in the last few days, the CEO claims that competitors have been receiving much higher aids. For example, he says that at least 50%. Well, you know, Aaron, I like to check these things. I like numbers. And I did check how much do their competitors get in Europe, for example. So I looked into Air France KLM, which has a fleet of around 330. I calculated how much money I divided the money they got, which is 12 billion, by the number of fleet, and I got $38 million, which is at least 4 times as much as El Al has received per airplane, according to the CEO himself.
So you're saying that his request is actually more than fair?
Absolutely. Absolutely. His competitors have received much, much more in support.
What are the consequences should El Al not get the money that they're requesting? Are we talking shutdown? Are we talking bankruptcy?
Well, it can go as far as that, but in the meantime, we're talking about the layoff of about 1,500 employees. We're talking about cutting down the fleet from 45 to 29. And also narrowing the destinations and the number of flights per day. This could really bring El Al, the national airline, into a very serious situation and even the threat of bankruptcy. And I think it's a pity because, you know, it's not only the national airline, it's a brand, it's even a global brand. It has made a name for itself as a very secure airline. And it's really a pity that it cannot get all the funds it needs in order to survive.
Why do you think that the finance ministry is so reticent to meet El Al in the middle here, or you know, provide a little bit more, or is it really just too early in the negotiations to ask that question?
Well, I'm not sure whether the government will be able to provide as much because, as you know, the budget deficit is really, really huge, the biggest in the country's history. I looked into other industries. Other industries have received less than El Al has received. If you look at small businesses, if you look at the self-employed, they got a lot of support. And I guess the government has run out of money in order to be able to support. And I hope that somehow they can raise the money either by an external investor or somehow to get this money infused. Otherwise, it will have to cut its force drastically and really put itself into dire straits because, you know, the problem is really that there are not enough tourists coming into the country. September 19th, small groups of tourists were able to flow into the country, groups of 5 to 30 people. Hopefully this will boost its business, but I'm not sure whether this will be enough. It might be too little, too late.
All right, now you mentioned, you know, maybe turning to foreign investments. You know, how much are we talking here? Can El Al survive waiting that long? How many more employees does it have to lay off to stay afloat for such a thing to happen? And as you said, you know, what kind of situation are we leaving in El Al really with when they're asking for what you are saying is a fair amount, but the government, as you also said, can't necessarily afford to pay it?
Well, if things go as they go now and it doesn't get the 150 million that it needs, it will have probably no choice but to downsize its labor force and again, sell some of its airplanes. We're talking about selling 16 airplanes. And the smaller it will become, the less the competitive advantage it will have over its international competitors, which are huge. They're really huge. And it really puts the company into a serious situation, which really threatens its existence.
Yeah, it sounds like a downward spiral, which I think we can all agree is something we want to avoid. Billy Abraham, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your insights with us.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Finally, before we go, it's time to learn some Hebrew with the latest of our limited weekly lessons from our friends at Ulpan O.
שלום, דינה מדברת.
שלום, אני רוצה לנסוע לישראל בספטמבר.
לאן אתה נוסע?
לתל אביב. אני מחפש מלון נחמד, קרוב לים ולמסעדות טובות.
יש לי מלון מצוין, מלון אור. קרוב מאוד לים וגם למסעדות ולבית קפה קטן ונחמד.
יופי! אולי יש גם קולנוע קרוב?
כן, יש קולנוע קרוב וגדול. אתה יכול לראות סרט כל יום אם אתה רוצה.
יופי! אני מאוד אוהב סרטים.
סרטים, מסעדות, בתי קפה, חנויות יפות, הכל קרוב למלון.
וואו! אולי יש גם בנק קרוב למלון? אם אני הולך כל יום לסרטים ולמסעדות, אני צריך כסף.
בטח, יש כמה בנקים קרוב מאוד למלון.
מצוין! אני רוצה שבוע במלון אור בתל אביב.
בסדר גמור.
Now let's take a look at the weather forecast. The weekend coming with a bit of respite from the heat. The sky is expected to be clear to partly cloudy with average lows tonight dropping to a comfortable 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. Then average highs tomorrow rising to about 84 Fahrenheit or 29 degrees Celsius. And now, before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral here in Israel. Israel's awesome wildlife. It's, oh. He's, I think he left something in the car. No, you're not going to get in that way. No, and now they're definitely not going to get in. This is sad. You know, it's just a fight on top of the car for who wants to drive, I think. Got to call shotgun. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.2 shekels to the American dollar and 2.53 shekels to the Canadian dollar. And finally, for the latest updates and news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, as well as to our newsletter at iltv.tv. I'm Aaron Porras. Be well. Thank you so much for watching.